Well, welcome everyone to the Dartmouth Energy Collaborative Winter 21 seminar series. I'm Rosi Kerr. I'm Dartmouth's Sustainability Director and your host for today's deck lunch. We're really happy to have you join us. I think we're the lunch that's rounding out the winter semester series. So we're happy to do that. We're joined today by Robin Tindell, the Environmental Stewardship Team Leader at Hypertherm, and Alex Jaccaci, the Corporate Improvement Program Manager at Hypertherm, although he's here in his UVA hat, which I'll describe a little bit more in a minute. Coming back to Robin, Robin's background is in engineering, and she is responsible for helping Hypertherm meet an aggressive set of corporate sustainability goals, having to do with all of the operational areas you would think of, like electricity and waste and water. And Alex, wearing his UVA hat, he is the founder and chair of the Upper Valley Adaptation Working Group, UVA. And that group is a regional partnership that advances the mission of climate resiliency in the Upper Valley in local New Hampshire and Vermont communities. He also has a Hypertherm hat as the Corporate Improvement Program Manager. And Alex's background is in systems and sustainability performance improvements with a kind of a system lens. I'm going to let them introduce themselves in greater depth. I am Rosi Kerr, as I said, the Director of Sustainability at Dartmouth. And I'm going to start off our presentations today. We're going to do 3 presentations, one from me on Dartmouth and our role in improving our climate infrastructure and resiliency in the Upper Valley. We're going to then move to Robin to talk a little bit about Hypertherm and Hypertherm's role in doing so, and then move to Alex to talk about UVA, and then move to all of you and your questions. So that's our format today. Please feel free to put questions in the Q&A function on your screen, and we will turn to those questions at the end of the presentations. So without further ado here, I'm going to try to share my screen. So our operative question today, the frame for our conversation is around climate responsive infrastructure. Over the course of the deck lunches this semester, you've heard a lot about different types of climate resiliency, climate adaptation, and climate change action. Communities that are doing work to improve their climate change response, and also research that's being done in this area. Our question today is, what can we do at the local level, and whether that's Dartmouth College or the Upper Valley or the company level like Hypertherm, to leverage policy, financing, and technology innovations to ensure energy infrastructure anticipates systems transitions and climate change. So today we're talking a little bit more about climate adaptation. And for me, this has been a really great thing to think about, to kind of put my climate adaptation hat on. My role is, in the local infrastructure that I think about, is the Dartmouth campus. So I came back as a Dartmouth alum to work on the Dartmouth campus on sustainability, because this was a scale that really resonated with me. Dartmouth as a community of 4,200 undergrads, 5,000, 6,000 employees, a couple thousand grad students, set in a community of 20,000 residents, has a metabolism that's much like any city in the world. And all of the cities in the world are facing climate change challenges and asking this question around climate resiliency and how do we adapt in a changing world. For me, this scale, the Dartmouth campus scale of, say, 300 acres with all of these inputs and outputs, was a scale that I felt like I could really affect change on. So if you think about Dartmouth as a microcosm of Mumbai or Boston or Miami, with certainly different constraints and requirements, but all of the same human needs for inputs and outputs, such as food and staying warm and dry or cool and air conditioned. This is the scale that I work on. The Sustainability Office at Dartmouth, for those of you that are not familiar with it, works at the junction of the student experience and Dartmouth's physical operations. So on the one hand, that sort of metabolism that I just talked about, Dartmouth breathing in resources and exhaling waste. And on the other hand, our core business, which is releasing students out into the world who hopefully will have an incredible impact, and probably disproportionately, fairly or unfairly, will shape the future of the world. So how do we provide those students with experiences that help them understand sustainability and that make them excellent problem solvers in the face of sustainability challenges. That's kind of what our office does. And ideally, the intersection of those things is where it gets really interesting. How do we have students work on Dartmouth's sustainability challenges? So this question of what can Dartmouth do to become more climate resilient is the question I want to focus on today. We have relatively ambitious greenhouse gas emissions goals. And I think when this conversation started off, so I came back to Dartmouth in 2010, one of the things that we were thinking about a lot was Dartmouth's obligation, right? As a relatively privileged institution that was relatively rich in resources, what is our obligation to work on this big issue of climate change? And I think everyone agrees that we have an obligation to reduce our emissions and our operational impacts and to have, as much as possible, a net positive impact in the world, right? So we set these ambitious climate targets that were based on what the science at the time was telling us we needed to do to avoid the most catastrophic impacts of climate change. So a 50% greenhouse gas emissions reduction by 2025 and 80% reduction by 2050, which was in line with the G7 at the time. We also had these more finely tuned goals, one to improve our distribution efficiency, another to change our supply from exclusively essentially fossil fuel energy supply to renewable energy supply, and then the greenhouse gas emissions goals, which I just showed you on the graph. I think an interesting question for this conversation is, how do we think about these things while simultaneously improving our resiliency and making not only Dartmouth, but the surrounding community better and more resilient to climate change over time? What are the things we can anticipate that are going to change as climate change impacts the nation and the region? And how do we do these things, meet these climate goals, while also adapting to those things, these future climate conditions? Dartmouth's infrastructure is in many cases really old. This is our power plant. When it was built in the 1890s, it was on the edge of campus. It's now in the middle of Hanover, right? Everything grew up around it. And I think this is an example of a piece of infrastructure that is not particularly climate resilient. It emits an enormous amount of greenhouse gas emissions out of our smokestack, but it also does not make us adaptable to these future conditions. So this is a question that I think about a lot. When we first started talking about Dartmouth's energy landscape, using energy as an example of an area of climate impact, on the left is Dartmouth's current, or 2018, but it's essentially the same now, energy consumption. So if we took all of Dartmouth's MMBTUs consumed, British thermal units consumed, millions of British thermal units, and we put them all on one pie chart, this is what it looks like. 72% of our energy consumed comes from number 6 fuel oil burned in our heating plant, 26% comes from grid electricity, and 2% comes from rooftop solar. The operating question at the beginning of my time at Dartmouth and our conversations about sustainability that have occurred since I've been here was, how do we replace that big red part of the pie with something better? And originally that was, what can we burn that's better than number 6, right? And we've been through lots of phases of that. Many of you have followed them closely. And asked lots of good questions as we've gone through those phases of, what about, natural gas? Is that better or worse? Truck natural gas, liquid natural gas. What about biomass? Is that better or worse? What about, I don't know, algae-based oil or oil from the process of rendering meat? Would that be better? What are the things that are better? One of the questions that I think has really framed Dartmouth's recent transitions and our transitions in thinking have been moving from this way of approaching the problem. How do we replace what we're doing now with something that fills that 72% of the pie, to how do we do things really differently in a more resilient fashion? So this is a sort of complex chart from a trip that we took, that Dartmouth took with the town of Hanover to Denmark. The reason we went to Denmark is that, like Dartmouth, Denmark uses district heating to provide most of its heat. Unlike the United States, Denmark does this for 97% of its buildings. So almost all buildings, homes, businesses are connected to a central heating facility, a local or larger than local heating facility. In the 1880s in Denmark, those heating facilities ran on fossil fuel and used steam to distribute heat. That was first generation district heating. Now they're in fourth generation district heating, That is, they're looking at what are the diverse ways we can find and capture heat and distribute it to places that need heat. Similarly, how can we distribute cooling? And how can we move to a low carbon system that does that? On the top of this, you can see the temperature level of their distribution is going down. That's the red line. And the energy efficiency of their system is going up. I think it's notable that Dartmouth is still on the left side of this chart, right? We're still in Denmark's first generation, arguably second generation district heating. Our operating question is, how do we move to fourth generation while skipping the generations in between and learning from places like Denmark that have already done this, the difficult, sometimes painful lessons that they have learned along the way, right? Not on here is what is the impact on resiliency of these different transitions? How do we think about what we're doing in terms of making our systems more resilient over time? Also not on here, but something that needs to be captured is what are the requirements that are going to change in terms of heating and cooling and how we think about buildings that are going to be driven by climate change? So, an obvious one in Dartmouth's case is more days where cooling is required to be comfortable in indoor spaces. 50 years ago, Dartmouth didn't cool anything. 50 years from now, Dartmouth's going to have to cool everything, right? So that's an obvious one, but there are less obvious ones, like how is residency in Hanover going to change, and how are the requirements of that going to impact Dartmouth? So that's something that I've been thinking about as I think about climate resiliency for the college. And this is difficult. So if we think about, okay, like Denmark, we need to move from using steam to distribute heat to using hot water to distribute heat and cold. We have infrastructure that's already built, billions of dollars worth of infrastructure that's already built, some of which was built in the 1800s or the 1700s or the 1900s or the 1960s, or when oil prices were really low. That's not good because those buildings are really inefficient. All of them have different systems because they were built, in whatever style was appropriate at that time. So we've got to figure out, how do we take this diverse bucket of infrastructure and make it more resilient and efficient over time? And that's not totally straightforward, and it certainly isn't inexpensive. So this is a map of Dartmouth's campus looking at the types of heating that are used in buildings now. And this is just one example of the kind of infrastructure that's going to have to change to make us more resilient. So the red buildings are all steam, which is not very efficient. The blue are hybrid, and the green are hot water, but not necessarily the same temperature of hot water in each building. So we got to kind of take this big patchwork and make it a more efficient system. We are thinking about how do we bring in other sources of energy into this system. So this is Rooftop Solar. When I arrived at Dartmouth 10 years ago, we had 0 solar on the Dartmouth campus, which was kind of amazing. Well, that's not true. We had a demonstration project on Thayer building, and we had solar thermal on the President's House and on the Sustainable Living Center, but we had no large scale solar photovoltaic. We are adding sort of solar photovoltaic as we go, and it is, once we started doing it, we've done a lot of it since. So we're now at probably 3% of Dartmouth's total energy consumption in rooftop solar photovoltaic, and that will certainly be part of our picture going forward. I think the harder question is, what do we do with that heating demand, and how do we make that resilient over time? And certainly part of the answer is transitioning from steam to hot water, which are what these pipes are. And Dartmouth is doing that all around our campus. But there are lots of other parts of the equation that we are only just beginning to explore. So I think the big question is, how do we move not only from thinking about, solution X versus solution Y, but from one approach to a new approach? If the old approach was, how do we replace number 6 with something we can light on fire and use to make heat? The new approach should be, how do we think about a resilient energy system going forward? And how do we think about that infrastructure in a way that makes it more resilient over time, not less resilient over time, right? How do we think about it in terms of what the climate is going to be like in the Upper Valley in the future? So this is, I borrowed this from the engineering group, right? But this is one schematic of an energy system, right? With lots of different inputs into the energy system, lots of different places where we capture heat, maybe some combustion. But I think more and more we're moving from how do we replace combustion X with combustion Y to how do we move away from combustion altogether and develop a resilient energy system? So in answer to the question of what is Dartmouth's role, what can Dartmouth do? One thing we can do in the Upper Valley is develop a resilient energy system, and not just an energy system, also resilient water systems, resilient waste systems, and resilient transportation systems. one of the things I've been thinking about a lot is what should Dartmouth do following something like what happened in Texas? What should we learn from that, right? There's a lot that we can learn from that. And we're lucky in many ways that we have a very different resource environment than they have in Texas. We also have a very different future than they have in Texas in terms of the likely climate impacts in our region. But we have a lot of work to do to move from a system, for example, Dartmouth's food system is totally dependent on the national agro-industrial complex to provide us with food, right? Obviously, things get pretty uncomfortable if there's a disruption in that food supply and we have 3,000 residents who are eating in our dining hall. Things get pretty uncomfortable pretty fast. So how do we reconnect our local food system? Similarly, how do we reconnect our local energy system? The other questions include, how do we leverage our privilege to try new things? What are the things that maybe other places can't try, but Dartmouth has a little more leeway to try because we have more resiliency in terms of our financial picture, right? We're less pushed around by the market than other institutions are. We have a 50-year time horizon on a lot of our planning, which is a luxury that many businesses, I don't know, Hypertherm, how long your planning horizon is, but Dartmouth, we think in 50 or 75 or even 100-year increments, which is very unusual in the business sector. And then how do we think about our role in the community and having a close partnership with the community so that what we do raises all boats? For me, as I thought about this topic, those are the things that Dartmouth can do, and those are sort of important principles as we move forward. With that, I'm going to pass the mic to Robin. I wanted to ask Robin to start off with a little bit by way of introduction about herself, just a little bit more of an introduction into how she got into this work, and what her driving passion is in this area, and then she'll lead us into her slides.
Great, thanks, Rosie. So how did I get into this? So I like that the map is up on the screen now because I grew up just over the river from Dartmouth and from Hanover in Vermont. And I definitely think that that had a lot to do with my appreciation for the environment and the natural world. And when it came time to choose a major in college, I kind of just knew that I liked science. I liked environment as well. But at that point, there actually was not a specific major called environmental engineering. It was in the civil engineering department at Princeton, which is where I got my undergrad. And I actually started out in mechanical engineering. I'm not sure exactly why, but as soon as I found out that I had to take more than one thermodynamics class to be a mechanical engineer, I switched to be a civil engineer, and that is where the environmental department was, luckily. So I majored in environmental engineering within the civil department, and then after that, I worked with various consulting firms, but doing real environmental engineering design projects. And what I found was that most businesses just wanted to do the sort of tried and true, boring, minimal, meet the regulation type projects. And I was kind of surprised and naive, I guess, like, well, what about all the cool stuff I just learned about in college? So I decided at that point that I needed to understand businesses from the inside in order to have a bigger impact. And so that's why I got my MBA after about 6 years doing environmental consulting. And after I got my MBA, I went straight into manufacturing. And knowing that I wanted to use that environmental lens at some point, but kind of waiting for the time to be right. And Hypertherm is what really brought that together. I had manufacturing experience coming into Hypertherm. I also had the environmental lens, and I was hired into a corporate improvement role with Six Sigma and lean manufacturing, an expertise I also gained in the business world. And then I was able, with Hypertherm, because it's a mission-driven company, to really apply that sustainability lens to a manufacturing company, which is what I've been doing there for the past 10 years. So that's kind of a little bit about how I got into that.
Thank you so much for doing that.
So Rosie, did you want me to go into
Yeah, why don't you dive in, and you should be enabled to share your screen. So whenever you're ready, you can pop up your slides and dive right in.
Great. All right, so first, as my screen sharing comes up here, I'll just explain what Hypertherm is. So we are an industrial cutting solutions company. And so a lot of people hear that we work in plasma. It has nothing to do with blood, a different kind of plasma. Plasma cutting is basically using an electric arc that runs at about 20,000 to 30,000 degrees to cut through a conductive material, so metal largely. We also manufacture water jet cutting equipment. So that's using a high pressure. If you think of a pressure washer, but this is much more intense than that, about 50,000 PSI, pounds per square inch of pressure to cut through any sort of substance. So it doesn't need to be conductive. So with a water jet system, you could cut through a foot thick piece of marble or concrete. With plasma, you could cut through up to 4 to 6 inches of steel, for example, in manufacturing the hull of a ship. So one of the reasons that although it's a local company, you might not heard of Hypertherm or its products is because we're a B2B company. And so we sell to other manufacturers. They are our customers, and that's what you see up on the screen right now is all of the different sectors that we sell into. So you can see lots of infrastructure companies there, as well as anyone who builds a building really. So you think of education and healthcare, trucking companies, tractors, artists as well, people who make artwork out of metal or other materials, again, whether it's plasma or water jet, and automobiles and HVAC, people who are making a lot of consumer products are our customers. So now that you kind of understand that landscape, I'll just give a quick overview as Rosi did to what we've been doing over the past 10 years from a sustainability standpoint. We've just wrapped up our set of 2020 sustainability goals, and we had goals across our products, our logistics, and our operations in the categories of waste, energy, and carbon. And so where we've wrapped up some of the big successes that we've had there, from an energy efficiency standpoint, COVID definitely threw us a curveball. So we ended at only about 5% better than our energy efficiency in 2010. But at the end of 2019, we ended at about 16% better. So that's really more of a true mark of our efficiency improvements. We did meet the definition of zero waste to landfill, coming in at just under 1%. Waste to landfill, and avoiding over those 10 years over 24,000 metric tons of waste to landfill. We had big successes around our logistics as well. 68% reduction of carbon due to our logistics. And that came from a big shift from air to ocean freight, as well as lightweighting of our products and packaging. We have highly recyclable products across different product families. We're at about 99% recyclability of our products. Our product efficiency improved by 34% over the decade. Through doing various life cycle assessments, we discovered that our biggest impact is actually with our customers. And so that's why it's appropriate that this slide is still up here. It's really the impact that our equipment has when it's doing its work at our customers that has the biggest impact on the environment. And that's both through the energy that our products use. So if you think of compressing water to 50 or 60,000 PSI, or making an arc of electricity that's 30,000 degrees, those take a lot of energy. It takes a lot of energy to do that. So our customers are using a lot of energy. And then beyond that, our customers are also using really carbon intensive materials. So if you think of a 4-inch thick piece of steel, you cut a part out of it and you have scrap left over. That scrap, of course, gets recycled, but even recycling it is carbon intensive. So just the fact that that scrap exists and that there's leftovers is a huge carbon impact that we're looking to work more with our customers in the future to reduce that impact. So that's a little bit of background about what we've done in the past 10 years, and we've just set up our 2030 sustainability goals as well. So looking at the next time horizon. And I would say that the kind of overarching theme, and if you compare our 2020 to our 2030 goals, is really much more about interconnections. So whether it's interconnections with our customers, interconnections with our suppliers, and that whole systems view, that yes, we have more control over something that's within our four walls, but we're not going to have as big of an impact as if we partner and work with others. And so that's really what we're focusing on going forward. So my next slide here is really just kind of going to give you something to look at. If I can share it. Yeah, there we go. As to some examples of business opportunities and risks related to climate and infrastructure specific to us. Um, and so the first one I will touch on is looking at our supply chain. So we make this complex manufacturing equipment right here in New Hampshire, but of course our suppliers are all over the world. And so any natural disaster, whether it's climate related or otherwise, has a huge impact on us. And so the example is what just happened in Texas. It's probably inevitable to say, guess what? We had suppliers that were there and they were impacted. And so now we've had some instances where we have components that we cannot get, and therefore we cannot make products and we cannot ship products, and therefore our customers cannot make their products. So we need to think about that in the future in terms of not just our own resiliency here in our own location, but what does resiliency mean for our suppliers, because it directly impacts us, and how can we help them? How can we partner together? How can we diversify and impact our suppliers so that they are more resilient? And so we've started doing that several years ago, but more intensely in the past year, where we are surveying our suppliers for a lot of different sustainability attributes and risks. And that helps us, first of all, just to choose a supplier in the first place. And it also helps us assess them once they already are a supplier, assess them and sort of kind of grade them and audit them over time, but also to partner with them about expressing concern about these risks before they happen and seeing how we can work better together to avoid the pitfalls of these natural disasters. Another great example is mining, and a lot of mining techniques. We use a lot of metal of different types: brass, copper, aluminum, steel alloys in our manufacturing. And so we're highly dependent on mining. And water availability is really tightly tied to being able to successfully run a mine. And so now that we're seeing more intense droughts and droughts in different places than they have been located in the past, we will be running up against that with our mining suppliers. It's also becoming more unpredictable. So a mine in an area that has not been water constrained in the past could suddenly be water constrained, and then we would be constrained in the products that we make. So that's another thing that we have to face along with our suppliers in terms of resiliency. So a lot of this has to do with diversification, kind of an ecosystem approach to looking at our suppliers. Geographical spread, partnering, even the way we set up our contracts. We feel like we're kind of big because we're here in the Upper Valley where there aren't other manufacturers, but it turns out when we go to buy a component or a material from, say, a big supplier in Texas, we might make up 2% of their business or 5% of their business, right? When they're in a crisis, they're going to keep their customers going who are more important to them than we are. So that's something that we need to consider as well. The next thing that we need to think about is our logistics. Logistics, the cost can be a driver, obviously with pricing our products, with who's able to buy our products, with looking at our own profitability. And one of the things we need to consider that could change with various natural disasters or other economic drivers is fuel availability. Would we be ready to pivot and have a different mode of transportation for our logistics according to fuel availability issues? What about labor availability? You've probably heard about some of the labor problems that have had to do with ports during COVID. And then, of course, if you think of we are trying to move as much as possible to ocean freight, port access and ports in general can be at risk due to rising sea levels. And so how do we again, diversify the places that we ship out of, the partners that we have, the different types of logistics. What about also considering things like postponement is a manufacturing term for right now, we do not do postponement. We make everything here in the Upper Valley and we ship it to, say, China for some customers. We have a big distribution center there. Postponement means maybe thinking about some of the things that are heavier or bigger and maybe not as specialized, that they could be added to our product there. One great example is coolant. Our products run at high temperatures and they have a radiator basically in them, just like your car does. And we actually ship coolant with all of our products, but it's largely made up of water. Why wouldn't we have that really heavy item added at the very end? Why does it need to be added at the first step in the logistical process? And what could that do for us filling an ocean container more efficiently with products that are of higher value add for us and for our customers, of course, along with reducing the carbon footprint by a large amount. So those are all things that we need to think of. And they're actually going to become more and more economically favorable. Right now, of course, we could make an awesome argument for postponement from a carbon standpoint, but a lot of these disasters and other economic drivers that are aligned with climate are going to allow us to make a financial argument much more quickly. We also have to, of course, think about our operations. Actually, I'm going to skip operations and go to customers because my operations segues right into where Alex is going to talk about after me. The customers that use our equipment, they're manufacturers just like we are. So we have a lot of the same concerns and can understand some of the constraints that they're going to be under. One really obvious one is our water jet customers and where they're located. And again, the question of drought. Right now, we do not manufacture and sell a water recirculation system. There are others who do, but as a company that sells through OEMs and through other system integrators, we're not really involved in that conversation with a customer to say, all right, you're buying this amazing system from us. It's going to give you great quality and great process, XYZ. We're not yet having the conversation of saying, well, if you care about your business continuity, you really should try to have a closed loop water system so that you can keep cutting when there's not enough water in your area. And of course, we should be more proactive about that in even selling in the first place. A customer who's already experienced a drought, when considering how they're going to cut their materials, might really shy away from a water jet system, knowing that it really depends on that resource. So we really need to be in tune with those risks that our customers are going to face so that we can understand how they even make their purchasing decisions in the first place. And that could have just as much to do with our plasma systems in terms of just access to reliable electricity. You need that to run our equipment, so we need to understand that. So back to operations. I bring up the example of Tropical Storm Irene because I was living just over the border in Vermont in a highly impacted area during Hurricane Irene, where I was without power and without water for a long time. Luckily, I could come to work and take my showers at work. And it was like a different world because over in Hanover and Lebanon and at work, there was just like nothing was wrong. But for, that handful of miles, Hypertherm could have been without water or without power because of that event. And so we need to think about our own operations, our labs, our bathrooms, of course, but our more intensive water uses around manufacturing, and how would we ensure our business continuity if our water system went out? Rosi mentioned the payback times of making some capital expenditure decisions, and a really good decision that Hypertherm made when we built our new facility, which is at 71 Heater Road in Lebanon, was a water recirculation system. Our other buildings do not have it, but that building saves, it's between like 10,000 and 30,000 gallons of water a day are saved by that recirculation system. And it was not something that was off the shelf. It was a custom designed piece of equipment that was very complicated and had something like a 20-year payback. But that was the right decision. It was a much longer time horizon than we generally make decisions on, but avoiding a risk that was potentially very serious. So I'm going to segue over to Alex. Maybe he can do some talking about our property, the same property there, 71 Heater Road, which was really designed with the ecosystem that was already there in mind and designed with stormwater mitigation in mind as well.
Take it away, Alex. And you're welcome to start with Robin's question, or you can start with how did you get into this mess in the first place, if that's a helpful frame.
Sure, great, thank you. Thank you, Rosie. Thanks for having Robin and I here today. And Robin, we've worked together for quite some time, and I still learn more about your background. And so it's great to be even on a panel together here today as well. And thanks for your comments. Yes, Hypertherm, I'll just give a quick response to that question, which is I was in the building during a storm that we had in July, I think it was in 2017, focused really right over Lebanon, and we have 4 inches of rain in 1 hour. It was actually the storm that wiped out some of the community and housing and the road on Slayton Hill, you may recall that. I remember being at Hypertherm and seeing the water level coming all the way up close to the loading dock doors, which would have then flooded our entire 71 Heater Road facility with a lot of machine tools and expensive equipment. And thank goodness the water mitigation system that was designed, the engineering solution, kept that water at the appropriate level and discharged it away from the building. So it was an engineering solution that proved to be very useful in that situation. So just very briefly, a little bit background about myself. Robin, it was great to hear you tracing the genesis of your interest in sustainability back to your undergraduate. I was going to share the same story, which is freshman year at University of Vermont, sitting in a large seminar with 200 students on an introduction to environmental studies is where I got hit, a lightning bolt came, and I said, aha. There's something out there in the world that's bigger, than me. In fact, the interconnectedness nature of all things, all creatures and all systems really captured my attention and my heart and my passion. From there, I went on to design my own major at UVM in sustainable design and looking at sustainability solutions and focusing in housing design as well. And then actually launched a business coming right out of UVM, graduating, and went and built earthships and sustainable buildings in Colorado for several years following. Follow that bouncing ball a little bit forward, and I ended up working at Alice Peck Day Memorial Hospital as a member of the administrative team, and now I'm at Hypertherm for the last 9 years. So what I wanted to share with you all, and what Rosie asked for me to kind of frame some comments around, is what is the Upper Valley Adaptation Work Group, and what are we doing in the Upper Valley? And it's really, I'd say, a focus on building what we would call the human capital or the social capital of resilience. We're building leaders, we're building engagement, we're building communities through education, research, and public engagement. But just to frame what is climate resilience as we're looking at it at UVA, we're really looking for the ability for a community to anticipate and to see the impacts that are already occurring or will be occurring, to prepare and respond and then recover from those impacts in a way that minimizes significant disruption to our lives and compromise of shared resources. And that really goes across many areas. We cast a very broad net. In fact, that net is about as broad as you can cast. What's being impacted by climate change? I think everything falls under the answer to that question. But we're really looking at it from multiple angles within UVA. So what UVA is it's a working group. I founded it actually in 2011 when I was at Alice Peck Day. It was actually the genesis of a master's program where I was working on organizational design and leadership at the time. And the question I was asking and wrestling with is, what would it take for a health system to proactively engage and address climate, both from a mitigation and adaptation standpoint? So one of the outgrowths is we identified we needed to create a coalition, right? The hospital wasn't going to be able to support the region of our patients and services alone. It needed to be a coalition. So that was the genesis of the adaptation working group, recognizing that there was good work being done in the Upper Valley focused on mitigation or energy reduction, weatherization, clean sources of energy, et cetera, to reduce carbon emissions, but that there had been very little work being done on adaptation, which is recognizing that we've already been experiencing climate impacts, and those impacts are projected to increase substantially as the climate is projected to change substantially in coming years. So we created an organization that was really about building resiliency in the Upper Valley region. These are some of the focus areas that we have worked in. And this is the leadership structure. Of note, Eric Osterberg is the vice chair. He's been a member of UVA right from the beginning. And he is an associate professor in the Department of Earth Sciences at Dartmouth. And he's been a strong partner all along. And I'll circle back to more comments about Eric. We have become a program at Vital Communities. For those who are not familiar with Vital Communities, I'll share a website here in a minute. Great long-standing organization of looking at community engagement around resiliency and sustainability topics. So very briefly, what have we done? We've part of our mission here in terms of the public outreach and community building. We've done several forums, usually about 2 a year, across many different topics, flooding and infrastructure for municipalities, targeting different audiences, agriculture with farmers and food systems, public health, forest ecosystems, nonprofit, and even business. We have a website where we are looking to be kind of a resource hub and a connection to resources, tools, other members of the community working on these topics. We have an adaptation program website, and then also a sister program at Vital Communities is around energy. And so there's many resources there around energy efficiency, opportunities for businesses, homes, incentives, and different weatherization type programs as well. So a good wealth of resources there. And our goal is to continue to build this out to be a place where people can find guidance and connect with others in this work. Another part of the mission is really looking at what are some of the key questions that we need to better understand as a local region here in the Upper Valley. What are the issues that are going to be impacting us? And what do we need to anticipate? So trying to ask the right questions really starts to tee into creating a great partnership. As I mentioned, Eric Osterberg, who has been doing some research, also with Jonathan Winter, who's in the Department of Associate Professor in the Geology Department, have been asking really critical questions, looking at climate assessments, looking at extreme rainfall and floods, and what are we going to be seeing in the coming years, looking at heat and droughts, looking even at public health, Lyme disease related to climate. So we're trying to fuel and then leverage and then partner with local research so that we can get that into the community and people can be better informed and aware. We did a project in 2015 with a University of Vermont group with a professor by the name of Amy Seidel and her senior undergraduates. They were working on a climate adaptation course, and we paired them up with 7 different businesses across the Upper Valley. And then they did climate assessment, impact assessments with respect to climate impacts that were specific to the businesses. And they came up with a set of recommendations about how each of these businesses could become more resilient and look at business continuity, including emergency management plans, infrastructure considerations, building volunteer corps, et cetera. We have been working for the last couple of years, a program we developed called the Climate Change Leadership Academy. In 2020, we graduated our first 20 climate change leaders who were all educated across the science, mitigation, adaptation, and then they came up with a project that they wanted to implement and then gain some guidance around their leadership with respect to their project. This year, we're partnering with Rosi and others from the Dartmouth community to integrate design thinking into the curriculum, and we're very excited about that. We have another 20 leaders that are getting ready to kick off the program in the next week here. And just to bring some awareness as well, we've had great partnerships with Dartmouth, particularly with students and student groups. We've worked with Ashley Doolittle at the Center for Social Impact for many years. She has connected to us. I think we've, as I was counting, I think we're up to 8 or 9 classes we've partnered with. And we've also worked with with SYNC, the Social Impact Nonprofit Consulting Group, and some students there. Of note, in the Nelson Rockefeller Center for Public Policy and Social Sciences, there was a student group there that was actually evaluating local nonprofits and awarding grant funds. And we were actually awarded a grant fund through that engagement with the students in that class, which was the seed to the Climate Change Leadership Academy last year. And so that was very fruitful. We also worked with Eugene Kowarski and the Senior Design Challenge. And we had a group of students that created a Climactor app. So this is an app that we will be making. It's in its beta phase or prototype, and we're hoping to continue to develop it so that people in the Upper Valley can be very easily finding what can they do to become more resilient and to take action, and also with some social networking, kind of challenging and learning from friends and whatnot. So I'm going to wrap up with that. UVA is been I think a positive influence within the Upper Valley, building that social capital and that engagement and that leadership to be prepared and building the resilience that's so important. So with that, I'm going to hand it back to you, Rosi.
Yeah, thank you both very much for helping us understand the context of our local community a little more deeply. We have a couple questions in the chat, and I have a couple of my own. I think I'm gonna turn to the chat and maybe lump some things together. We have a question from Eric Osterberg about Dartmouth's energy reductions, that Dartmouth substantially reduced our emissions close to 30% in the 2008 to 2016 window. And then according to the graph I showed, it looks like it slowed down. This is a fairly quick question, so I thought I'd answer it first. And the question was, what is that, how is that accomplished and why did it slow down? It was accomplished, energy efficiency is most often accomplished through really boring things that make a huge impact. Fixing leaky valves, updating heating, ventilation, and air conditioning, HVAC systems, those kinds of improvements. We did a couple really big projects to improve those things in buildings, some of which a single building like Burke Chemistry, where we updated the HVAC equipment, had, I think, a 12% reduction in our overall campus heating oil consumption because of its over energy consumption due to a sort of hyperactive ventilation system. We haven't run out of low-hanging fruit, but we do these things in kind of tranches of investment, and you're looking at one of the tranches. So the next round, the sort of energy efficiency 3.0, is where Dartmouth is focused now. And the cool thing about energy efficiency is that the fruit keeps sagging lower and lower. So you take the low-hanging fruit first, and then the stuff that seems high when you did that kind of gets less and less efficient as things like lighting efficiency improve, or heating, ventilation, and air conditioning improve in terms of their engineering. So we anticipate that energy efficiency will continue to be something that we go after to keep driving down our overall energy consumption and our emissions. With that, I'm gonna turn to this question that Eric is actually answering in the chat, but I think it's important for you, Alex, and Eric. You can feel free to pipe up as well in the chat. One of the things that you talked about was social resiliency, Alex, and I wondered if you could riff on that a little bit and talk about why social resiliency is critical And then Susan Kaplan asked us a question around how UVA is considering equity and just transitions as you work on preparing the Upper Valley for some of the climate adaptation work we're going to have to do going forward. So I wonder if you could talk to those points.
Sure. Yeah, social resiliency, I think, I'm going to start really as close to home as possible, which is personal resiliency. I think we've all certainly been tested in that in the last year, certainly with COVID. And I think we're tested with the news and the science and the data telling us that we are in for some tough sledding, to use a New England term ahead. So how can we be resilient ourselves? What mechanisms can we use to have personal resiliency so that we're acting from creativity, we're acting from wisdom versus from fear and reaction? Because we all know when we're in a panic, we can't be as creative and as wise as we can when we're kind of really kind of clear and lined up in ourselves. So I think resiliency starts with us. And then from there, as you're starting to look at resiliency, say within a neighborhood or within a community, it's really about building those connections and a support mechanism. One of the things that I was really, just touched by is during Hurricane Irene in 2011, basically stories of people helping recover and helping each other get their feet back on the ground after that storm was the story that was nationally and even internationally shared. How neighbors can really pitch in for each other. And there's organizations that were born out of that, such as UV Strong, with broad membership volunteers that are ready to support neighbors in need. So building those connections and having a common sense of belonging and purpose, I think, is critical at a community level. But I think it begins with us being in our best place and being most resilient so that we can take care of ourselves and then really contribute to others as well. And Rosie, what was the second question?
The question was around equity and just transition. So to what extent has UVA incorporated thinking about equity and just transitions, particularly as we think about dealing with race in the United States, dealing with inequity, socioeconomic inequity, racial inequity, et cetera. Are you guys thinking about that, and how is that being incorporated as you think about creating climate resiliency?
Yeah, no, it's a terrific question, and thank you for asking it. I would say that this is something that is very much on our radar, something very much that we're committed and interested in learning more about. But I would say we don't have all the answers yet. We just created a very, I would say, improved process to vet our applicants and to reach out to build our Climate Change Leadership Academy cohort to try to have a diversity of socioeconomic diversity and race. And it was very important and work. And I think the reality is we didn't see a significant bump on the needle. So it's something that we are very aware of and really, feel like we need to continue to put some substantial focus into. Certainly those that with the least resources are bearing the biggest brunt and shoulder of the impacts that we're seeing across the globe. We see that all of the time. And so environmental justice is a huge topic. And I think we're going to start to see that as well with climate migration, seeing those who are displaced and looking for a place to be able to call home. And that's not just going to be those that have tremendous resources that can buy homes, but there's going to be people that are needing to find homes without the resources to do it. So this is very much at the front of our mind, but we're very at the beginning of trying to understand how we can make a contribution there.
Oh, sorry. One question that I answered in the chat there was around the Climactor tool, which I believe is not an active resource yet, but you hope it will be a resource soon.
That's the hope. We made great progress with the student group that was in the Senior Design Challenge to get us to a prototype, or shall we say a concept. And we're actually looking for the opportunity with student groups and maybe some grant-supported funding to take it to the next stage so that we can turn it into a product and a tool that people can really benefit from.
One question from Liz Ryan Cole was around how UVA is supporting local and regional planning commissions so that bylaws and ordinances are addressing climate change. I know this is a topic that UVA has talked about a lot, that there are these kind of planning constraints that towns have to deal with. Is that something you guys are working on? Is there a place we can send Liz to find resources? What's your guidance there?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'd say our two of our strongest and long-term partners have been the regional planning commissions on both sides of the river, the Upper Valley Lake Sunapee Regional Commission on the New Hampshire side, and the Vermont side, the Two Rivers Ottaquechee Regional Commission. Kevin Geiger in the Vermont side, Megan Butts on the New Hampshire side. Longtime partners, they are doing this work with their communities. UVA starts to become a source of guidance, inspiration, information, and a place that they can bring their community members to a larger conversation at a community level or even at a regional level. So tons of work being done there. I would certainly reach out to Two Rivers Ottaquechee and or the Upper Valley, and I can connect you as well, the Lake Sunapee Regional Planning Commission with Kevin and Megan, and we can get you connected. There's work that's happening at the regional level and at the town level on all of those communities.
That's great. In our remaining time together, I wanted to shift for both of you to this question of risk and how, there's sort of this risk opportunity thing in front of us as we adapt to climate change. As one of the things you mentioned, Alex, was how is climate change going to change who's living in the Upper Valley, for example, and that comes with opportunity. It also comes with potential for risk. How is flooding going to change? Potentially there's opportunity, but also risk. I wonder how you guys are thinking about risk and its flip side, opportunity, and if you've seen changes in how your organizations or the people you work with, Alex with your UVA hat on and Robin with your Hypertherm hat on, have you seen changes in how people are reacting to that and the extent to which you're able to get traction looking at this kind of risk reward scenario? Robin, you want to start, and Alex, you can take it after that.
Sure. Yeah. I guess I feel like we still don't do a good enough job quantifying risk. I feel like it's more qualitative at this point, that we're having the conversation at some points. And at some points within our business, we're doing a better job of quantifying it. We just hired a risk office person, I believe 2 years ago. And she is kind of going through the entire business with a lens of risk. And I am interjecting and trying to get a voice in that process to bring in climate risk questions. But we're not there yet, or at least I'm not in on those conversations yet. I think it comes back to finance. It has to be communicated in a like for like way when you're making a lot of these financial decisions. Sorry, my microphone was up above my head.
No worries. We could hear you.
Okay.
Alex, you want to talk a little bit about that question?
Sure. I think risk assessment, risk management happens at so many different levels. At UVA, we're looking at it very broadly, but we're also looking at kind of specifically, for example, when we worked with those 7 businesses, we were trying to help those individual businesses assess their vulnerability related to climate and some of the risks. The regional planning commissions are working with select boards in all of the towns with their hazard vulnerability assessments, and also trying to bring a lens of what are the climate impacts. Let's look at the science of how many times these culverts have blown out in the last 10 years. And we've had a 100-year storm 4 times in the last 10 years, not once every 100 years. And so let's try to understand what the climate changes we're seeing, and let's be proactive to anticipate and mitigate those risks by taking some either proactive measures or at least even building it into the plan. So when a culvert does get blown out, we can go to FEMA and say, see, we anticipated this was going to happen, and this was a known risk. And so now we have the documentation, the justification to get federal dollars to rebuild that culvert. I think one thing that I've become aware of just in listening to infrastructure vulnerability is there used to be science out there, and in a study that would show for every dollar invested in upgrading your infrastructure by, say, moving the generator out of the basement, say, as an example, upsizing a culvert or a road drainage, for every dollar invested, saved $4 in reactive repair when those systems failed due to a climate impact, flooding, or otherwise. Now that research is saying for every dollar invested, saves $8. And if you can look at the billions of dollars that we're spending related to some of these climate events, such as Irene or Hurricane Sandy, which has happened in Texas, there's a lot of money on the table. And the question is, how deep are our pockets to keep rebuilding and bailing ourselves out, literally? How can we be proactive to make these investments up front where we have known vulnerability and risk, so because we know we'll be saving money over the long term?
There's a lot here, and it's really rich. There's another question in the chat, great question about how do we help individual homeowners find, the pocket change to invest in energy efficiency? How do we deal with some of the structural challenges or the systemic challenges that are keeping us from investing that $1 to avoid having to pay $8? And I know that's something you guys are thinking about as well. Maybe just, do you want to briefly comment on that, Alex? And then we can close out here. We're a few minutes over, but I think that's a really rich topic, and I know that Yuva's put some thought into that.
Yeah, well, there's definitely, and Vital Communities larger in the energy program has done a lot of work around weatherization, a lot of work around solarize, and also a lot of work around connecting people with the federal and the state incentives for upgrading energy efficiency, such as heat pumps and pellet boilers. So what I would encourage you to do is check out some resources there, but there is a lot you can do at a homeowner level around energy efficiency or energy systems. And then in terms of vulnerability to climate impacts, a couple of years ago, I set up we have a solar tracker, and I wanted to get a little bit more light, but at the same time, we took some time to take down some old pine trees that were starting to split and fall apart that were close to our buildings. And so we said, why don't we just do that at the same time? So just as a property owner, look at your risks. What might happen in terms of the next storm or the storms we've been seeing? How can you anticipate and be proactive with respect to those as well?
Great. Well, this is obviously a rich topic. I feel like our Q&A is starting to heat up, but unfortunately we're at time here. So we're gonna stop here. I'm gonna shamelessly replug Eric Osterberg's shameless plug in the chat that the next public forum for UVA will be happening this fall, and it will be on climate migration with strong ties to climate justice and equity. So that's something to look out for. I would encourage you, I think Eric and Alex are doing really great work and are supported by the great work that's being done at Hypertherm, directly and indirectly, as a partner in UVA. So I would encourage you all to check out UVA and get involved. And I know that, part of what they're getting to is, what is it that we as individuals can do? This is a question that Eric and I have talked about in the past. How to, even people that work on climate change all the time, it's hard to figure out how to make decisions about our own behavior. And it sounds like that's what your climate tool is trying to get to. And that's what a lot of the Vital Communities resources are trying to get to. So I would encourage all those on the call to check those resources out and figure out even the small steps that we can all take to make our lives more resilient here in the Upper Valley. Until then, stick together, be kind to each other. I feel like that's part of our social resiliency, and especially in the time of COVID, and enjoy this gorgeous warm day where I hope the sap is running. Part of my resiliency is to store up sugar in the form of syrup. So enjoy the day, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll look forward to seeing you at the next Irving Institute deck lunch. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.